Hello, and welcome to episode 28 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Lorne in Napa Valley.
Yes, sir. And today we have a special episode to talk about, the very recent September 2019 LSAT. We're going to do a recap for you guys today.
Which for us was, the test was yesterday.
That's right. Yeah, so if you're keeping track, that is Dave and I working on a Sunday. No surprise.
Getting out there.
No great surprise.
That's right. So, John, what are you drinking today?
Yeah, speaking of working on a Sunday, I was up awfully late last night for the wrong reasons. Well, the right reasons if you're listening, but the wrong reasons for fun. I was talking to students like deep into the early hours of my morning till probably 3:30, 4 a.m. So I have poured myself a coffee and topped it off with some Jameson, an Irish coffee, I suppose, as they say.
Good old Jameson.
Yes, sir. I know you were up late last night, too.
I was up quite late. And by the way, I like Jameson, but only in an Irish car bomb.
Oh, there you go. We've actually had a whole episode largely devoted to that.
Well, I can say that I was up late. I talked to students until probably 8 o'clock Pacific, and then I was like, I have to go to this party. And then I ended up very late at the party. So for me, it's just straight coffee, no Jameson, a lot of creamer.
Did you run out of Jameson last night? Is that what happened?
I don't know. We ran out of everything last night.
Including,
still feeling it today.
Including good decisions.
Indeed.
But there are some good decisions today because we're listening to one of my favorite artists and a great song.
Yes, and off an incredible album.
Yeah.
Purple Rain is the album. The artist is Prince, and the song is Computer Blue.
That's right. In homage, as it were, to the first all-digital LSAT, at least in North America.
That's exactly right. And if you've never heard that song, by the way, or that album, go listen to it.
Yeah.
It is phenomenal, and I love the movie, too.
That's true, yeah. We're going to put a link to the official video. You will see a very greasy Prince playing a very beautiful Telecaster straight out of the gates. I've got a birthday next month, Dave. If you want to get me a present, that guitar would be an awfully nice one.
No.
Not Prince's, but just,
just another guitar?
Just another guitar for my 30.
Well, there's a famous line in that movie where he says, you have to purify yourself in the waters of Lake Minnetonka.
That's right.
And, of course, I went to Minnetonka High School, so that always beats close to my heart.
There you go. Did you purify yourself?
Many times.
I just can't.
Spent a lot of time on that lake.
I can't not see Dave Chappelle serving pancakes.
and those guys playing basketball.
Yeah, that's right.
Prince was serious.
Game blouses. Yeah, every time.
Charlie Murphy. Let's get to the test.
Yeah, let's do it. All right, so this is going to be a focus on the September 2019 LSAT. It is still going on, by the way. If you're taking an accommodated test, or if you had perhaps center issues or something and got delayed, there are people who are going to be taking the test even after we have recorded and released this particular podcast. So this is very much kind of like still in the wheelhouse of what's happening this week.
Well, still for this entire test event, although there is no guarantee that those test takers will take the same exam.
That is true. Yeah, and we'll talk a little more about reuses of this test as we go. But that is the test we're going to focus on September 2019, the first all-digital test, and it's something of a milestone.
It is. It's a huge milestone for them, and especially after what happened in July with the transitional test. Here, it's their first full run at it, and I would say overall it went better than July went. That would be my overall assessment. I heard a lot more positive feedback about this test experience, but there were still problems, and this is something that I don't think is going to go away. I know that LSAC said earlier, we're going to stamp out all the problems, but it's really difficult to do that, especially in a full-on iteration of over 20,000 test takers or so.
Yeah, I want to clarify your point. When we talk about this was better than July, what we really mean is administratively or logistically, this was better than July. As we will see very shortly, there were a lot of reasons this was not better than July, but that was more due to test content than operational.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to have to bear with me. I'm super slow today.
No, but it was, in comparing it to July, which is really the first taste of a digital test experience, all of the things that we saw go wrong in July, there were still instances of those, but they were much reduced, much minimized in this particular regard. There were fewer check-in delays, tablet failures, center issues. The proctor seemed a little less confused this go around, which is actually saying something. But there were, as you just mentioned, there were still some problems. So just, again, to cover those bases and make sure we're making people aware of some of the things that you may still face on a future test that certainly still are plaguing this administration. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that people struggled with yesterday.
Yeah, we'll go through it really quickly, sure. I think, simply because it's a matter of chance whether a lot of these things would come up to someone taking the test in the future.
Right.
So we know that at the July test, there was a lot of delays in terms of people checking in. We still had those. Yeah. And again, there were some delays that were like an hour. Sometimes it was an hour and a half. There were delays all the way up to 3 hours.
Yeah.
In terms of just getting checked in and getting your test started. And it's not that you should walk in expecting it. You should just be mentally prepared to have a plan if this occurs. As some people said, they're like, look, after sitting there for an hour, the coffee had worn off and I just wasn't really mentally in the groove. I had been ready to go and now I wasn't.
Yeah, you show up ready to take a test at 8:30 and you don't start till 11. I mean, that's really a jarring event. That delay is a struggle to get through. What are you going to do to make sure you're as sharp at 11 as you would have been at 8:30 or 8:45 or 9?
Yeah, and you got to think about that and prepare for it.
Yeah, and one of the we talked a lot about this on the heels, and I think it was our July Redux, as we titled it. But that podcast, we talked a lot about the idea of like, look, bring a snack for pre-test, not just the break, but beforehand. Make sure that you can run through your same warm-up mental exercises right before you walk into the center, even if it's 2 hours after you expect it to start.
That's exactly right. And it's tough because you get a delay like that, you're going to get hungry.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's all sorts of negatives that come along with delays. You just don't want to have to deal with it, but it continues to happen. I think it's going to continue to happen. Some of the things they ran into that caused these problems, they didn't have enough tablets at certain locations. They didn't have the right password at another location. Issues like that are going to cause holdups, and no one's really to blame, but then again, everybody's to blame.
For sure.
When something like that happens.
Let's talk about some of those like center by center issues that people do run into. These were not like exclusively the causes for delays. Sometimes it just takes a long time for them to process individuals sitting down. But there were center by center cases of genuine concern and sometimes catastrophe, like true fallout. Usually this comes down to the inability of a proctor or set of proctors to get a tablet, the main hub tablet, to sync with the Wi-Fi at the center, and then to be able to monitor the various individual tablets that are distributed. That's, as my understanding goes, that's how it is.
That's exactly right. So, and one could actually say, at least for those people who showed up, they were eventually able to take the test in most cases. There were places like in Berkeley and I think up in Washington where they had to cancel the test the day before. They got emails from LSAT at, say, 5 o'clock saying, hey, there's not going to be a test tomorrow because we don't have enough tablets. The shipment didn't arrive.
Yeah, which is a slightly different issue than the one I just referenced. There were a number of West Coast test centers where LSAC, and this is my take on it, maybe there's something else involved, but just didn't ship out the actual hardware soon enough, and it wasn't going to arrive in time for test day. And what did that mean? It meant that they, instead of just, again, substituting paper tests, as we've said they should do, it meant they've delayed people. And I think the email quote, Dave, was, at some point in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing, but yeah.
Yeah, so if you didn't get to take your test, you will get one eventually. I suspect strongly that'll be a different test.
Yeah, me too.
And not this one.
Makeup tests are almost always different.
Yeah, as some people said later, they were like, well, those people were the lucky ones because this, as we'll talk about, this wasn't the easiest test.
Yeah, but we will see.
Either way, when you're actually at the test center, there were delays in a number of instances. So just be prepared for that.
Yeah. The center cancels that I was referring to before are more like when you show up, when there are tablets on hand, when everything, by all appearances, is going right, but the proctors can't make the tablets actually all link up, whether to themselves and to the main hub or to the internet itself.
Yeah, this happened in July. It happened again yesterday.
Yeah, there were a couple of centers in Florida in July, notoriously, where people just sat there for hours while the proctors struggled to just get the internet to work and couldn't send everybody home eventually. That happened a couple of times yesterday as well, unfortunately. People show up, everything looks great, but you get sent home because the proctors can't make it work.
And apparently, in one instance, I think in Binghamton, New York, they were in the middle of the fourth section and there was some type of malfunction or problem. And the end result was they canceled the entire test. So you're 4 sections in and all of a sudden they're like, yeah, this test is canceled out. It's not going to show up as a cancellation on your record because it was an LSAT problem. But I don't know that I could be any angrier at that point. I'm like,
it's a cancellation on your spirit. That's what
you've done 80% of the test, or at least you're heading towards 80%. And they're like, yeah, guys, it's been great seeing you.
Yeah.
Have a nice day. You can go home. That didn't count. Kind of a rough situation to run into.
That's grisly, man. I mean, that happened for a fire alarm, 2 fire alarms, I think, in Canada in July. But this is the first I've heard, at least, of them having to cancel a digital test partway through because of tech issues.
In the middle,
yeah.
I mean, this was the great fear that you would have problems like this. And I understand that you can't control every aspect of technology, but then again, this wouldn't have happened with a paper test.
That's right.
So it's the consequence of making this transition. I don't think it's going to cause them to go back to paper, but no. I would be worried if I were them just to get this stuff straightened out. Because when people started taking the test, they didn't always have a seamless experience either. I think a lot of people actually enjoy taking it. And when the tablet runs well, people are able to get through it and they find that it's pretty cool. We still had issues though, and I think we're always going to have issues with tablets freezing or dying in some cases, and then having to go through that process of replacement. And it is apparent now that they can replace the tablets very quickly, but you still lose time.
Sure.
And so it's frustrating to all of a sudden have a problem. In one case, somebody talked about they started a section and the questions weren't there. And so they just sat there looking at it like, well, is it supposed to show up? And they glanced around and realized, well, everybody else is working. I'm screwed. And then they got it replaced. But it ended up, running it cost them like half a minute. And then they ran a couple minutes longer while everyone else waited for them to finish, which is kind of a comical thing. Everybody's looking at you. Sure, they killed all those questions.
Yeah, one of those early morning delays that I read about was because one person's tablet, for whatever reason, wasn't linking up, and everyone else in the room was fine, and they sat there waiting. I don't want to quote the amount of time, but it was over half an hour, while this one person's tablet was troubleshot, as it were. They just couldn't get it to link.
Nobody wants that kind of attention before the test either.
Can you imagine all those eyes on you?
Frustration.
Yeah, and that wasn't the only hardware thing. Obviously, the tablet situation yesterday was better than July. In July, we heard just countless people struggling with their tablets freezing or glitching or running out of batteries or just whatever. Yesterday was far better. But some of the issues we saw in July, like tablet freezing, did occur. One of the common complaints from July was definitely still in place yesterday, and that had to do with the highlighting function.
It's still a struggle, apparently. And it looks to me like LSAC actually changed the stylus slightly. I mean, they certainly changed the color. I think the first one in July was blue and this one was black. Yeah. So maybe they were trying to react to that. And I think it was better as an overall issue, the highlighting. I didn't hear quite as many complaints as I did in July. So again, I think they'll continue to work towards solving this as a set of problems. It's just something that it's not going to be, you can't escape from it 100%. There's always going to be an issue of some sort here.
My suspicion is that there's been some sort of like meet in the middle scenario that's occurred where LSAC has improved things a little bit and people's expectations have adjusted as well. Where they know like, all right, listen, this stylus is going to suck. It's flimsy and cheap and terrible. So I'm just going to use my finger. And so we hear less complaints. That's what I think is happening here.
Yeah. I would have to say that there's some truth to that. And in fact, you saw a lot of people come out of it and they're like, yeah, I had no problems. And they were very excited in almost a surprised way.
Yeah, when no issues arise, it becomes like a happy, like a fortunate coincidence.
I think we've done a pretty good job of widely publicizing some dire warnings about that.
I will say, on the whole, September so far, and we're still going to run through a few more of these, and maybe I backtrack on this. September was better than I thought it was going to be. given how bad July was. Maybe you disagree. I mean, we're both still. Look, I don't want to hold LSAC. I don't want to lower the bar in terms of the standard that I hold them to. But July was so bad, the bar was so low that this was a greater step forward than I thought it might be.
Fair enough, although I felt like this was about what I expected.
Okay.
I get where you're coming from because there were a lot of problems. You know, one of the things that LSAC said was, well, we had a really high completion rate. And we talked about this in July, and I'm like, that's not how I measure this. It's about the entire experience, not just whether somebody finally got to finish their test at 5 p.m.
Yeah, you were able to finish after a 3-hour delay on your 4th tablet. Congratulations, that counts. No,
that's not a success to me. And I think this time around they were a little bit more successful. There were still other complaints, though. I mean, the scratch paper.
Yeah, still an issue.
Still an issue. The watermark that they have on there is a problem. The quality of the paper is not great.
No.
Somebody was saying, don't press too hard on this. You'll go right through it. And I'm like, well, that's always been the case with these.
Yeah, I've torn many an LSAT page in my day.
Yeah, and somebody was stopped from using a pencil on their scratch paper at a location. And I'm like, knowing the basic rules of how this operates is paramount for these proctors. And to not understand that and to tell people, oh, you can't use a pencil, it's like, please get up to speed on what the actual rules are here.
Well, let's talk about the proctors. They were better this time. Everything was an incremental improvement. Everything was still far short of, in my opinion, sufficient for the amount of money they charge and the gravity of the consequences of this experience. So, proctors.
Had some problems, did you?
Well, yeah, I mean, it turns out the proctors are still people. They're not perfect. One of the more just mind-boggling things that I heard about is a proctor in at least one center, or at least one case, accidentally paused a test just in the middle of a section. Everybody's running along, and all of a sudden everything freezes.
Which has got to be a funny moment when the proctor's like, whoops, my bad, guys. I totally did not mean to do that, obviously.
But the fact that you can pause the tablets is useful, because sometimes events arise where a pause is necessary.
Yes.
For instance, in at least one place, and I'm pretty sure it may have just been a lot of people from the same location, which I think in this case was CSU, which is in California, Northridge. There was a fire alarm that went off. I think I heard about this in a few different places, but CSU Northridge was the most,
CSUN.
The loudest about it. CSUN, that's right.
I used to teach classes on the CSUN campus.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I love it up there.
Is it a fire hazard? Because apparently yesterday.
I'm not a fire hazard.
You are most certainly a fire hazard. You were just a hazard, period. But yesterday there was a fire alarm that went off in the middle of Section 3, at least in this one place, and the proctors in the room, for the people reporting this, didn't know how to pause the test. So for 2 or 3 minutes, they're just sitting there, forced to continue testing as the clock ticks, with a fire alarm blaring. And eventually one of the test administrators for the whole place runs in and pauses the test and shuffles everybody outside like a proper elementary school fire drill.
The actual person who knew what to do.
Right. But 2 or 3 minutes passed before that person came frantically scrambling in to do the right thing.
I think when you approach a test like this, the tendency is to think everybody who's doing this is going to know exactly the importance of it. They're going to know everything about how it works, and I can trust them. And that is the case in a lot of instances. The problem is that you run into certain proctors who don't really care, and their phones are going off.
Yeah, saw that a bunch
and they're messaging, and you can hear little ringing bells and stuff like that. Or they don't really understand how the system works, and although they're well-meaning, they don't have the knowledge to actually control situations like this. Now, hopefully, there's no issue. But what I always say is this means that when you get to the test center, you need to actually talk to the proctor and ask a few questions. Hey, have you done this before? Are you comfortable with it? Make sure that they're going to allow you to do things like use a pencil when you're working with your scratch paper, because it is clearly allowed and no one should stop you from that. One thing that apparently people were allowed to do yesterday was, in a lot of cases, they were able to raise up the tablet to greater than 30 degrees without being stopped.
Which is great, by the way.
Well, that stops the glare issues, right, which we knew were a huge problem last time. And I didn't hear as many complaints about glare and related issues. And that could be because, we're now into September versus like high summer in July. But at the same
I think the
time,
glare was mostly overhead fluorescent lights. I would like to take some credit for it, you and I, because
you think we caused it?
No, I think we resolved it. What we told a lot of people going into July, and certainly on the heels of it, was, listen, if glare is going to be an issue, adjust your seat position, ask for a new seat, move the tablet, or, I don't want to say break the rules, but push what is written versus what is allowed. Prop your tablet up steeper so that it's not reflecting a direct ceiling view into your eyeballs. Prop it up.
Well, it's quite clear that the enforcement of various rules and even the understanding of the various rules is really widely varying.
Yeah.
There's no consistency whatsoever when you actually go from place to place. And maybe you could say, and if LSAC was sitting here, they'd be like, look, at 80% of the centers, they all did it the same. That's great. I'm really happy about that. What about the other 20%?
Sure.
There is absolutely no room for error if you were proctoring a test. And as a student, you don't want any errors. You don't want any problems. And you should push for them to get it right. And so ask questions when you get there.
Yeah. Anything less than 100% in this case is, to me, failure. And I hope that LSAC continues to hold themselves, or begins to hold themselves, to such a standard. What you've just introduced, Dave, I think is really important, which is not so much the potential issues that you'll face, but the practical remedies for them. What do you do, and as we will shortly discuss, what do you not do if you do encounter a problem, whether with the actual logistics or the administration or the proctors or the hardware or the test content itself? Now, the first half of that, the logistical side, you report it. You need to say something, you need to get it on record, talk to a proctor, have them put into not only your file, but just the test day manuscript, really. Have them record something, hard copy, so that when you go back to LSAC after the fact and say, like, listen, this was my problem, you've got record of it and a potential, remedy for it, or there's some sort of like reparation. What do you not do?
Well, that one's simple.
Yeah, this is simple. Well, you
don't
would
walk
think
out
simple.
of the test.
Yeah.
Don't just get up and walk out of the test.
Please don't quit in the middle. We saw a number of reports yesterday, and I'm not trying to pick on anybody individually. If you were one of the Redditors who posted about this as your experience, just take this to heart, I hope, and don't take it as judgment. Don't quit in the middle of the test. Don't walk out. Don't use the break as an opportunity to sneak off to your car and drive home or to a bar. This is...
Well, if you're heading to a bar, maybe I can approve.
Well, no, stop it. The bar's open after. Listen, there's an opportunity, worst case, even if you know you're going to cancel, at least experience the remainder of the content. Why would you not?
Yeah, just sit down and do it and work through it and get more used to working with the tablet. Make sure that everything's comfortable. Even if you're in the middle of section 3 and you're like, I'm going to cancel this. That first Logic Games wasn't great. This one's worse. I can't keep this score. I'm just not. It's not happening.
What you're describing is someone who knows that Logic Games is experimental, and even then, both of the sections went terribly.
Yeah, basically, they've had 2 sections. They're like, this test isn't going my way. I don't feel good. Whatever the reason might actually be. Don't walk out at the break. Be like, all right, now I'm going to recalibrate my mindset here, and I'm going to take the last 2 sections and see if I can come back from this, because maybe next time during the real test I might have to come back.
Sure.
And also because it's more of an experience. You can learn from actually just working with their hardware. That's an important thing. You don't get many opportunities to do that.
Yeah, seat time is just immensely valuable. Plus, you've already paid for it. It's not like they prorate your discount or your refund if you walk out through, 3/5 through.
Or even give you a refund.
Right.
They're notoriously
I only did 3 of the 5
those.
sections. Give me $80 back. No. No. You might as well just experience the rest of it. Again, as you say, like, just get acclimated more to that experience. To me, one of the points you just made is arguably the most valuable potential of all of it, which is, all right, I'm in a ditch right now. This is going as badly as it could. Let's call this worst case scenario. Can I recover? Can I make this next section amazing? Even if I know the overall I'm going to cancel it. What can I do in section 4? What kind of resiliency can I instill in myself? The ability to try to do that when it even if it doesn't matter, but when it's real, when you're sitting there in a room full of strangers, man, that is so valuable to go through. Good or bad, success or failure, that is an incredibly useful, teachable moment.
Test yourself.
Yeah.
All right, let's get on to the actual test itself.
I think it's time.
Get out of the precursor discussion.
All right.
So let's start off with a disclaimer,
Sure.
which I think is fair given the position that we're in here. All the information that we're going to use to talk about this test, it is fully public.
Mm-hmm.
It is out there on various chat boards, on Twitter, you name it. It is things that would not be biasing for anyone to hear about because it is already pretty much public knowledge.
Sure.
Now, there are things, of course, that we know about this test that I think would be biasing, and we won't talk about them. We're not going to talk about specific answer choices. We're actually not going to get into great detail about questions. We're not going to talk about rules and games.
Strategies, setups, any of that, yeah.
None of these things are going to be part of this discussion because you're not supposed to disclose those things after the test. And we're not going to disclose them even if we happened to know about them.
And even if we really, really want to. As I do. I have some things to say, and they're just going to have to wait until October. I'm sorry.
Technically we're not bound by the rules, but I respect, the desire to keep this a relatively pure environment until the test comes out.
I think we're bound by our own self-instilled integrity in this, that I don't want anyone who listens to this and hasn't taken the test yet to get a leg up. That would not be right.
Yeah. I agree with you on that, and that's part of one of the reasons that we won't say anything incredibly specific. But we can talk about broad impressions of the test, and that can be really helpful, especially for those people who are sitting there thinking, should I keep this or not?
Sure.
So let's first off talk about, has this test ever been used before?
Interestingly enough, when we did the crystal ball for this test in the next two, October and November, we talked about the fact that September was very likely not going to be one of these February reuses, one of these large-scale reuses. We thought it would be something that, when given to the masses and ultimately released here in several weeks and then a month and a half or whatever it is for the public, we thought that this would be the first time they would put a test into widespread usage, and we were right. However, this was a test that saw a brief glimmer of sunlight, as it were, last September for Sabbath test takers. This was the September 2018 Sabbath Observer LSAT. Now, that's a very small audience here in North America. So was it strictly all brand new? No, but yes. This is the first time it ever really saw the main light of day.
Well, as we know, a lot of these main U.S. administrations have been previously used in one form or another, and they've all been tested as experimental.
Perfect,
so nothing is really ever entirely new. But was this one of these kind of big non-disclosed tests from February of past?
Right.
No.
Was this the February 2014 reused in July 2018 for everybody? No, it was nothing like that. And that's exactly what we said. So
the interesting thing here, though, is we're talking not about a Sabbath test from, say, 2015.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about 2018. We're looking at about a year later, and that tells you that the stock of tests isn't exactly deep. Because if you were using something from last year, there's got to be some urgency to do that. Otherwise, it would just be better protocol to have it out of circulation and discussion for a couple of years.
Why not use a Sabbath test from 2015 or 2016? Those have already been burned in a lot of cases. They've used those up already.
We knew this was going to happen. This is one of the reasons that we were able to predict the July test last year. It's why we've made certain predictions about tests this year. They've amped up the number of tests being given every year, and consequently, the so-called library or repository of unused tests.
The vault, as I call it sometimes.
The vault is, it's a little threadbare at this point.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a problem. And so for them, I don't like this. I do not like it when they're low on tests because you become more predictable. And I think from a testing standpoint, that's problematic.
Yeah, I think you do like that from your angle. From their angle, though, this presents an issue, especially leading into 2020 where there are 10 tests on the calendar. How in the world are you going to fill 10? And none of those tests will be the same test, by the way. They're not going to use February again in October next year.
Yeah.
So next year is going to present 10 unique tests. Notice I didn't say new. 10 unique tests. How in the world are they going to staff that roster? when they're already having to reuse a test from just 12 months ago.
I'm glad it's not my job. It's their job. They didn't have a huge amount of time or warning that they were going to go to this. I think this was all moved through very quickly. So it's just something to be aware of. I think maybe in the future they may drop down the number of LSATs they're giving.
I think they're almost going to have to, man. Especially now that the GRE seems to have faded, not into obscurity, but at least into the background a bit.
I don't think the GRE is going to go away.
I don't either. But I don't think it's quite the looming threat that it was, say, 18 months ago.
It's not a threat of immediacy. It's not being adopted as fast as I'm sure they would hope that it would be adopted.
As who would hope? ETS, right?
The GRE, yeah.
Okay.
However, my feeling about the GRE is that it will slowly but surely grow in stature, and it eventually will be considered an equal part of the process.
Yeah, I think that's true. It just had this staggering momentum, this frightful, almost furious kind of adoption rate for a little while. And that seems to have tapered off. And so I think you're probably right. The 10 tests, I believe, was largely motivated out of a sense of just fierce competition. Yeah, fear, period. Yeah.
Fear. You can take the GRE whenever you want. We better add more LSATs. Yeah, they ran into some institutional backlash, and, that's something to deal with.
Who's they?
ETS again.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm keeping you straight on your pronouns, man. I just want to make sure we're talking about.
Apparently so, man.
Sorry, today's not the day for it.
Don't nitpick me on the details here.
Not for me.
I'm struggling.
I know what you mean.
Anyway, the interesting thing is that when they're low on tests like this, and they've got a lot of tests, this partially explains the new retake limits that they introduced fairly recently. Precisely. So if you're wondering why it is that you can only take the LSAT so many times in various given periods, this is part of the reason why.
And we did an episode not long ago on that specific scenario. So if you want to hear more about the retake limits and what it means for you, I encourage you to look into the back catalog that we've created of podcasts.
Indeed. So the interesting thing here is that when you go to this test and you take a look at it, it was 101 questions total, which is very standard. We do know that LSATs have ranged from 99 to 102 questions upon release over time. But 101 is it's probably the most common number that you actually get.
Yeah, for sure.
Back in July, we had a really weird thing occur with the experimental sections where everybody got a logical reasoning experimental section, which made it really difficult for people to figure out which one was, experimental and which two were real. This time we returned to what I will call normalcy, which is that you had some people with reading comp, you had some people with logic games, you had some people with logical reasoning.
Yeah.
So we had a pretty good spread, and that's normally what they do. But this is the first kind of like new normal test that they've put out. July was that transitional LSAT. So things were back to normal in terms of the use of experimentals, and that helped a lot of people. If you get an LG or an RC experimental, it's really easy to figure out which one's real, which one's experimental.
Yeah, I think the curveball that was the July experimental usage propped a lot of people up for uncertainty moving forward. And what we said, again in the crystal ball, was it'll go back to normal. This is going to be a test that looks a lot like, at least in construction section by section, it looks a lot like what they've done historically. And again, not to spend all our time here self-congratulating, but we were right. It was another one where there was an experimental of each section type.
I think that was the easiest prediction in the world to make.
I don't know, man. A lot of people came out of July feeling like they were just in this tailspin of who knows what might happen, this mysterious new world. And of course, it wasn't.
Well, it's a lot of uncertainty, and that definitely makes people uneasy.
Yeah.
So in a moment, we'll talk about each section by section. But now that September is over and done with, John, what are the implications coming up for the October and November LSATs?
Well, I think we have to take this part, or this discussion or prediction, whatever, in two parts. Partly it's easy to talk about because we can say, look, if they've gone back to normal, it's 101 questions, it's all digital, they've used experimentals normally, etc., and things seem to be a little bit smoother on the administration side. It's easy to make predictions for October and November because they're going to be more of the same. At the same time, part of the implications, as it were, for October and November are born out of the content itself. I think we have to look at the actual, section by section, page by page content on this test to talk about what we think might occur in October and November as well. So let me temper this discussion by saying I'm going to lean more into the first half of that than the second, until we've talked more about September. What does this mean for October and November? It's going to be standard, man. You're going to get experimental usage the same, 100, 101 questions the same. It should be smoother and smoother, test by test. The tablets will work a little better. The login and check-in situation is going to work a little better. If you're signed up for October already, congratulations. If you are not, tough luck. That registration date passed a couple of weeks ago. September 10th was when the deadline for October was. But you're not out of luck for November. The registration for November is October 10th, which is about 2.5 weeks from when I think this conversation will go live. But centers are, we've talked about this before, filling up quickly. In fact, a lot of them are already full. Hustle. Hurry.
Yeah. Get on a wait list if you need to.
Yeah. And a lot of those wait lists are actually being accommodated, as we've seen. We saw that for September. We've seen it for October.
In fact, LSAC made a statement to the effect that they were going to guarantee a seat for everybody. The question is how close is the seat to you? Hopefully very close, but that's not the guarantee.
Will you need a passport to get to your seat?
All right. So with that in mind, if you feel like you need to take the LSAT again, November is what you should probably aim towards.
It's almost what you have to as far as recency or proximity.
Yeah, it gives you 2 more months to study. It's still really early in the admissions timeline. You get your applications in and so forth.
That's a good point. And look, if you're looking at January, you're still good there too. I don't know a single school in North America, at least, that's not going to take the January test. As a hard rule, you might see it, but I think we can both agree, Dave, January is going to be a perfectly viable test for a 2020 start.
Yeah, last year a few schools tried to put a hard stop on November, and that was a challenge. I have not looked at the deadlines recently just because the admissions period is really just getting underway.
I don't think numbers have rebounded enough for schools to get quite that draconian about it.
Yeah, and right now the numbers for this upcoming cycle are trending lower than in the past. So if I don't care what school I'm at, I would be thinking maybe I should keep that window open as long as possible.
Heck yeah.
So a lot of that stuff ends up being slightly negotiable. But let's get to the actual test discussion because I think that's pretty interesting overall. And let's start off with our old friend, Logic Games.
Our old friend, although I think it made some enemies yesterday.
You think?
I'm not sure Logic Games is the prom king anymore.
This was clearly, and by a wide margin, the most complained about section on this test.
One of the most complained about specific to a test sections I think I've ever seen, if I'm being honest.
I've heard, you go back and think about the virus game on what,
I've heard people complain about a game. I don't know that I've ever heard a whole section get this amount of grief.
There was a lot of complaints about it.
Oof. And maybe we're just more like all ears than we've been before. Maybe we're just more attuned to it. But my goodness, man, the fallout from this Logic Game section is, let's call it somewhat historical.
Well, the interesting thing is that they'd used this as an experimental in June of 2017.
That's right. And then used it again in Sabbath of last year. So this is not the first time we heard these grumblings, but it's certainly the most, the epicenter of this was in a heavy population.
Yeah, each time this this game section has been used previously, there's been complaints about it, about the difficulty. And the section ended up having 23 questions. The game topics, which is what we can really talk about, was that the test opened up and, it seemed pretty innocuous. You've got like puppies and kittens.
That's as innocuous as a topic as you will ever find. Kittens and puppies, man, right? How great is that to start?
And then you had artifacts.
In a museum, right? Around a table, yeah.
Something like that.
Something like that.
And then we had flowers, which I will say was easily the most complained about game within this section. A lot of people were angry about flowers after the test.
I saw a lot of people saying, I came home and my boyfriend had bought me congratulatory flowers for finishing the LSAT, and the first thing I wanted to do was just throw them in the garbage disposal or, push him down the stairs.
And so I did.
Yeah.
And then the last one was about scheduling appointments.
Yeah, meetings.
And so from the 4-game standpoint, 23 questions is really standard. The difficulty, though, is according to the general commentary, was very high. A lot of people had said, I've been doing games for months now, and I've done every logic game there is. This was the hardest section that I've seen. Mm-hmm. This was just a complete killer. And I have two comments about that. The first is that I have been through many LSAT administrations, and the number of times I've heard people come out and say, this was entirely new, this was impossible, you could never do it, even if you had double time, is far too long for me to count.
Yeah.
And so I always take a healthy dose of judiciousness when looking at this.
Let me table your second comment for just a second, because there's going to be some people listening to this who are already pissed off.
No, let me finish then.
Oh, you have a second comment that's going to... Okay.
I'm not done.
Okay, go.
But the thing is...
Trying to insulate you against the backlash.
I'm not worried about insulation. I'll take it.
Take it.
The thing that happens, though, is it does look like the section was pretty tough, because you have like a universal commentary to that effect. And ultimately, when you're working with something like that, it's really tough in the moment to get a good feel for it. And as the day went on, I started hearing people say, well, it was really this game that caused me the most problem. I probably did pretty well in these other ones. It starts to feel a little bit more normal. The second thing, and I think this is where a little bit of the insulation comes in, is keep in mind that just assuming this game section was harder than average, and I agree that it was, there's going to be an offset elsewhere in the test. And so we'll talk about scale predictions coming up in a little bit, but it always means that if you run into something that's really hard, you're probably going to run into some stuff elsewhere that isn't as hard. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, especially during the test. It's one of the reasons why we're like, don't just walk out. Oh, this game section's really tough, I'm leaving.
Yeah.
Well, if the other 3/4 of the test are really easy, maybe it's okay that the game section was really hard.
There has to be some offset, which again, to your point about walking out, like don't quit midway through. You never know how you might be able to redeem yourself later on. So the way I explain this to students sometimes, and I'm sure you've had the same conversation, is listen, any standardized tests mandates that there's a finite amount of difficulty that the test makers are allowed to impart. And if they squander a great degree of that difficulty in one section or one game or wherever, then the rest of the test necessarily softens to balance the load, as it were, or to keep things under that threshold.
Yeah, and that's also how the scale works, as a safety valve
Precisely.
of sorts.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's just a release valve. And we'll talk about the scale at the very end of this conversation. But what I was hearing from people constantly yesterday, and granted, some of this is hyperbole, but there were a lot of test takers whose opinions I trust that were saying things like, I've never seen a test that didn't have a gimme game, that didn't have a single game on it that just felt like, all right, well, thanks for that at least. What I heard from a lot of people was that the first 2 games on this test could have very easily been the 3rd and 4th game on most other tests, 3rd and 4th being typically the hardest 2.
Often.
And that is rough.
That's a tough start, especially if you know that later games are widely considered to be much more challenging.
Yeah.
It's like starts at a high level of difficulty and goes downhill from there.
And putting the hardest game in the section, Flowers, almost universally agreed upon, 3rd, is also a little bit nasty, man. Because you're going to, even though it had the fewest questions, I think, of any of the games, it essentially squandered so much of your time that an easier option following it, for a lot of people, didn't get the attention that it really would have, I think, deserved or demanded had they been able to look at each of these games on level footing at first.
Agreed.
What do you do with that? What do you, David, do with that?
Well, if I discover that I'm doing something that's really difficult, I usually skip it and go to the next one.
Right. So if you're a test taker, I don't want to talk about strategy too much here specific to this, but in general, if you were to encounter a game and you're feeling like, man, I'm making no headway, this is just not working for me, and it's the 2nd game or the 3rd game or wherever, your move is going to be to pull the plug, right? Jump ahead.
I will bail out and move to something else that I feel is easier. But speaking strategically on a global level, about taking
not about this
games.
test.
This isn't about this test. Let's say you open up the test and the first game is brutally difficult. why should I start off with something really difficult? I'm by nature lazy. I want to relax. I don't want to have to do the hardest thing at first. I want to do it when I have the most amount of time, which is usually at the end. And so what I'll do is I'll be like, I'll read the scenario and the rules, and I have a pretty good sense of, when games are going to be difficult, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
I'll be like, yeah, not in the mood for this, man. I'm going to just move on. So I'll go to the second game, and hopefully at that point I don't see something that's worse. If I was like, this sucks too, I'll go to the third game. At least I know what I'm dealing with. And as I do that, one of the things that tends to come in mind is like, well, there will be an offset of some sort.
Sure.
If these first two games are really brutal, the third and fourth games will hopefully be a little bit easier. And so that's the universal advice that we always give about logic games. If you hit like the second or third game and it is rough, don't just bang your head against the wall. Move to the fourth game, do what you can with that, then come back to those earlier games and do them at the end. It's a simple cherry picking strategy. It's got to be part of your arsenal to not have a pride war where you're saying to yourself, I got to do it this way. I don't get into a battle with logic games mentally where I'm like, I must win each question in a row.
That's a good example too. Yeah, the questions themselves, the agility, the gymnasticism that you can have within the questions even is genuinely built around the reaction that you have individually moment to moment as you encounter it. I've analogized this before to like when someone drops me into a game, what I sort of visualize is myself in a round room, circular room full of like closed doors. Some of those doors are going to open really easily. Some of those doors are going to stick, but I can lean into them. And some of those doors truly may feel locked and I'm going to need to find a key behind another door. So if I try a door and it feels locked, I don't sit there and bang my head against it, as you said. I try a different door.
Yeah. Well, also, I look at the construction of the test itself as the matching of wits with people who I respect and know are super intelligent, the people who make this test.
You're saying that it's constructed intentionally to like obfuscate some linear progression.
Sure.
Yeah.
I've thought that for years.
Well, you don't even have to think it. It's just objectively true.
It's objectively true. It's infused in our courses and books about the way you take this test. This is one of the weapons they use against you. If you run into a section like this that you feel is like super hard, you have to then really kick into smart test taker mode.
Yeah, go try a different door.
Move around. Yeah, you got to try to work to your advantages too. So go to games that look nicer to you or that play to your strengths and take it from there.
Yeah.
Overall, though, if you walked away from this section and you thought, man, that was really difficult, you are not alone. Thousands of other people agree with you on that. And that's actually a very good thing that they would think that.
Yeah.
Because it means that your perception was accurate.
When you feel something's really difficult and you are alone, that's a problem. That's where the issue tends to live. I will say, if you walked away from this section and you're like, totally normal, piece of cake, then you're a bit alone in this. Because the wide consensus was that this was something of genuine, unique, standout difficulty.
I did have a few people I spoke to who were like, I understand the difficulty, but I was able to handle it.
Yeah,
that's different.
True. But people that are reporting over and over, like, I haven't missed a logic games question in months, I guessed on 6. Or, I normally go -0, -1. I know I missed at least 4. Or I didn't even get to finish the second half of the last game, when I normally finish with 5 minutes to go. These are the kinds of reports I was hearing over and over. Maybe I don't know. I'm going to put that on record, but that's what I'm hearing. We don't have a copy.
I'm not disagreeing
with
you. I am 100% on board. I'm just saying that doesn't mean that every single person in the entire country and Canada who took this thought it was hard.
No, I would never say that.
Most of them did.
I would never say that. There are no absolutes or universals when it comes to the LSAT.
Never. There's always some,
especially when it comes to difficulty.
Somebody always finds something easy. It's right up their alley. They loved it. They saw the key. They went out and crushed it.
Sure.
Either way, it was tough. I think we know that.
And we're going to circle back to this a little bit when we talk about the scale. Our prediction for what the scale is going to be. Briefly, we'll circle back to it.
Yeah. Let's move on to reading comprehension.
Fair enough.
What happened there?
Well, another experimental section from a recent test, demonstrating once again that they are really thin on novel content. Not novel in reading comp, but novel and unique. This was an experimental used first in the February 2018 test, and again, 7 months later, came up as the real test for Sabbath observers last year. 27 questions, totally normal there. Do you want to talk about the 4 passages? Because here I'm happy to report these were precisely what we predicted were going to appear. Not topically, but of course, but in terms of like the nature of the passages.
I actually heard a lot of people say they enjoyed reading these passages.
I heard that too, yeah.
And that it was an enjoyable section. So the passage set opened up with a discussion of Zimbabwe and the cattle economy and gold mines. I think maybe this was one of the harder passages because I saw more complaints about this than any of the others. So that was the opener. And if that is the case, that the hardest passage was first, that's relatively rare. They usually start you off on an easier note, but it is not unprecedented.
Well, it speaks again to your strategy, though, the idea of, listen, if you encounter something wherever it is in a section, and you haven't exhausted the section, and you don't like it, bounce.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Same strategy applies in reading comprehension as it does in logic games or logical reasoning. Something looks challenging, come back to it later.
Sure.
Especially on the digital test where you can just flag it and then quickly get back to it at the very end of the section.
It's more useful individually for questions than whole passage sets, but in this case, you can just jump right to the next passage. You see it in the navigation bar where the next passage starts. Go to passage 2, which in this case, I think probably was easier. It was the comparative passage, I believe.
About historical novels.
And truth and lies and autobiographies, I think, was a part of this as well.
Yeah, and I think this was the comparative passage, another humanities passage. So the first 2 were basically humanities that come out, and that's very normal on this test to have about half the passages in that category.
It's what we said would happen.
Yeah, and I think it was easy to predict in certain respects, so I'm not trying to take anything away.
Yeah, no, this was not us like with the great reveal.
No. The third passage moved into science, and that was a passage about cholera.
Yeah, the bacteria.
So that, from a science standpoint, I didn't hear the usual complaints about, like, this is super difficult. I think it was at least manageable. And then they closed out with a discussion that was focused on kind of like international environmental law, kind of like a customary law thing.
That's right.
So you ended up with the law-related passage. And so you see the spread there, science, law, humanities, very typical in terms of what they do. Overall difficulty on this, medium at best. Maybe even on the easier side, perhaps probably on the easier side, certainly not on a high difficulty side, because I'd say the general view of RC was, hey, that wasn't bad. I enjoyed reading it. Maybe I didn't like the Zimbabwe passage, but livable.
Yeah, so let me put this on a very short historical timeline in terms of what we're seeing relative to what we have seen, say, since 2018. 2018 and 2019 thus far, to me, have presented a lot of difficulty in reading comp and a lot of accessibility in logic games. This test flipped that script, as far as I'm concerned.
I think it's a good way to state it.
Yeah. The reading comp here, I softened up from what we've seen the last couple of years. The games here really took a turn, if you're not good at games, in the wrong direction. If you like games, this was ideal. This is the day. This, to me, as a test, this is exactly what I would hope for, personally.
Yeah, for you.
For me, personally. Yeah, that's why I say personally. Like, somebody else is going to listen to that and be like, well, you're a one-off, jerk. But for me, if you can do games, you can do any game, including flowers. You can do anything. Where the uncertainty lives, the unpredictability lives, is in the softer subjects. Reading comp, and as we'll talk about in a second, logical reasoning. The fact that they made those so much easier on this test than typical, and compensated with logic games that crushed a lot of really good games people. That to me is still right. That's my, alley-oop.
Well, the interesting thing was that I was asked more than once yesterday, so does this mean that they're going to start doing this on every test?
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about what this means for October and November. And this is what I was saying, the second half of that discussion. I think now we can get to it.
We can start talking about it. First off, it's really difficult to know. They do go through periods of emphasis. There's a period from several years back where the logic games for years was just really vanilla for the most part.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden we started to see, hey, that was a tough game.
June 2014 introduces a pattern game for the first time in 15 years?
Forever. Yeah, they do this. And what I've always said about it is it's actually good test making because they don't stay predictable. They have to move difficulty around. If you have, years of tough games, guess what? Everybody studies like crazy for games that get better and better. And then all of a sudden, your tough games don't have as great of an effect. So if you were making a test, what would you do? Well, all right, I'll just give them some regular games, count for that in the scale, and this time I'm going to give them brutal reading comprehension.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we saw in June, frankly.
Yeah. And then people aren't ready for that, and they're like, the reading comp was really tough.
Yeah.
Well, then they go out and they study for that, and then a couple years later, they switch it up again. We've seen some really tough LR, especially in the last year or so.
September and November of 2018, perfect examples of LR being just wicked.
Yeah, but the games and the reading comp on those tests aren't like incredibly destructive. And this is kind of what I was referring to about offsets. So when you look at the logic games on this test being harder, the reading comprehension all of a sudden is like very, very normal. And as you said, accessible. A lot of people felt like they did pretty well on this. Well, this is your offset, at least one of them. So as you look at this is how they construct tests. They balance difficulty. There is often one section that is harder than the others, and that means oftentimes there's one or more sections that are easier.
Precisely.
Depends on how they do it.
Shifting sand. What do you think this means then? Let's just put ourselves back to the wall. What do you think this means for October and November? Do you think we're going to see more game sections like this in October and November? Do you think reading comp's going to stay a little lower level like it sunk to here, despite the past couple of years being very high difficulty? When I say our back to the wall, I love that I asked you.
Yeah, you asked me and make me...
Our collective being, hey, Dave.
What's our opinion on this, Dave?
Yeah, what's our opinion?
Thanks,
and then
man.
I'm free to disagree with you or just say nothing.
I don't think we'll see games as hard as this. And again, this is being said without having looked at these.
Sure.
There are examples of games in the past where I'm like, like everybody complained about the stone and mulch game, and I'm like, that game's easy.
Right.
That kind of thing. So I need to make sure that from a firsthand standpoint that I agree ultimately that it is as difficult as people have reported. I will certainly think it's hard.
Yeah.
Usually the collective is, I think, fairly accurate in terms of expressing their opinion and being accurate about difficulty. So if this game section is as hard as purported, do I think future game sections are going to match that? No. I think it's less likely. Do I think we could be moving into an era of harder games? Yeah, I think it's possible.
I think it's.
And I know no one wants to hear that.
No, I think it's almost necessary on their end. What we've seen, and I've expressed two things to some of my tutoring students and various people who've asked in the last 24 hours. One is what we've seen as a general score creep, basically. And by score creep, what I mean is people tend to score better now than they did, say, 7-8 years ago. Certainly more than 15 years ago. Certainly better than they did 30 years ago, where they had to change the test itself to account for a lot of 48 out of 48s. You know this
I do.
Era well. What do they do to account for that? They tighten scales, something we'll talk about. And they have to change the nature of the difficulty. So do I think things are going to get, on the whole, harder? Yeah.
Well, you've seen sections of time here where reading comp has been tough and LR has been tough.
Yeah.
And we've had isolated individual games where we can go back, like that virus game that I mentioned earlier from 2016. There's isolated elements, but are we due for some tough game years? Yeah.
We kind of are. Yeah, they've taken a little bit. When you talked about the reintroduction of game novelty in 2014, June 2014 introduced a pattern game, and there was another one in 2015, another one in December 2016 with that building trades game.
That's a tough game.
And that virus game in September 2016. They just were suddenly pulling out some really wicked heavy hitter games. And then they stopped. 2017, 2018, were really mild. They were pretty tame. Reading comp began to absorb a lot of the difficulty.
Exactly.
And it seems like we may be swinging back into a game's direction. I don't want one test, especially one test we haven't seen, to necessarily be the arbiter of, well, here's this landscape shift, right? Like this seismic. I won't do that. But it does seem to be that now would be reasonable to assume they're going to move back in another direction. The other thing, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, if 2018 was a year of LR difficulty
and RC,
and RC definitely had been difficult prior to that, that puts us in a position at this point where it's like, what's the only remaining thing?
The cyclical
nature. It is
nature.
logic games.
Right, the cyclical nature.
And I know what you're saying, where you're like, look, you can't have one test be like, oh, everything is shifted, because I am certainly not that guy.
No, I know.
It's just from a logical analysis standpoint, it does make some sense that this would happen and they might move in that direction.
Look, they have to beat some drum, and they're not going to continue to beat the same one because people learn how to dance to that rhythm. This is going to have to change. Games make sense that now they're maybe cycling back into that a little bit. The other thing, though, that I've said to people is it's somewhat rare, often exceptionally rare, that you have back-to-back tests that exhibit this degree of profound confusion over a single section. I don't think October and November are going to present game sections that have this, and I wish I could say more specifically, I won't, that have the nature of what we just saw in terms of difficulty in games.
Yeah, we can talk about it when the test is out.
That's as precisely as I can say it at this point. I'm really biting my tongue.
Yeah, don't say any more.
Okay.
But I think the bottom line is I don't think the next game sections are going to be as hard. That doesn't mean they're going to be easy, though.
Yeah.
A lowering of difficulty doesn't all of a sudden say, oh, that was simple. It could still be very hard, just maybe not as hard as what we're looking at.
Do you remember the last conversation we had about flaws? We talked about relativity flaws.
Relative flaws. There it is, that was just what was going through my mind.
Well, I'm happy to say neither of us just committed one, so good for us.
No, we're fortunate to avoid it. And I actually do want to talk a little bit more about that, some of the tools they use, like the scaling. Sure. But let's go to LR here. And there were two sections of logical reasoning.
Shocking.
And the scored sections, one of them was 25 questions, the other was 26. So if you had that 26 question, well, you did, but if you were trying to figure out which was experimental and which wasn't, the 26 one was real.
Yeah. Hang on a second, because some people had two 26 question LRs and a 25. Some people had a 26 question LR experimental.
Okay.
Which means your 25 was real.
Your 25 was real. So you can figure out, part of what was real just based upon the question count there.
But the better way
is to know some of the actual topics.
That's my man. Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about some. You want to go?
You go.
Oh,
yeah, no, you go.
Me do it. All right. I'm not going to run through every single one of these because we've got a whole bunch of them. But let me hit some of the ones that were the most maybe commonly discussed. One of the ones that I saw coming up a lot was lichens, which is a fascinating symbiotic relationship. This is not about the question. This is just me waxing between mosses and algae, I believe. Lichens are a fascinating thing. You guys study them. David Attenborough's written a lot about them. I encourage you to read. But this is about the symbiotic relationship of lichens. Doctors talking about obesity and giving some advice there. There was one about engineers and airbag systems, which I thought was kind of neat. There was one about methane on a planet number 253 or something. I believe this was the final question in a section, if I'm allowed to say that. I think I am. Yeah. Commercial fishing boat weight. This is one of the more interesting things that I saw come up and created a little bit of confusion yesterday. The majority of the conversation yesterday and today has been about games. No mystery there. But there were two questions that were close in topic and people were mistaking them. One was about cortisol. One was about cortisone. The cortisol question was about PTSD, the treatment of it. The cortisone question in a different section was about using cortisone to treat pinched nerves. So make sure, if you're talking about those two things, you keep them separate. And then there was another question, this is the last one I'll mention, about gym equipment in one of the real sections as well. All of those questions were real.
You're not going to mention the nightclubs question?
Yeah, I mean, no. I didn't want you to have PTSD and need some cortisol.
If I made this test, I would make all the topics. Like
I know, something
really
fun,
liked.
Right?
Nightclubs, Las Vegas, gambling, having a few drinks.
Yeah,
it'd be excellent.
This would be a very redundant test.
Well, I don't. But, the thing is it's good to, at least recognize what some of the real topics were. Sure. That helps you sort out what was real and what was experimental for yourselves. But probably the most notable thing about these sections, in fact, if you had an experimental that as well, was the lack of reaction to the LR.
Yeah.
There was no kind of like, this was so difficult. Sure, there people talk about individual questions, like I found that tough. But the overall feeling about logical reasoning was, oh, that was really easy or relatively straightforward. Or at worst, oh, that was kind of in the middle. And the thing that I'll point out right there is you're talking about 50% of the test. And most people have reacted as if, oh, okay, I thought that was really fair.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I always think this, that no LR section is just easy, flat out. There's always tough questions in there. So I am not saying, oh, every question was easy. I'm saying on the whole, as a relative comparison to other LR sections of the past, this didn't have the level of difficulty that a lot of people have seen.
Yeah.
Now, could it be that there were some really sneaky questions in there? Of course.
I was about to make that point.
Yeah, there's no way. I did not take this particular test, and so I can't come back and be like, oh man, that question about the nightclubs was brutal. And I bet tons of people miss this. And that is something that happens when I'm going through LSATs. I'll be like, oh boy, this is a really attractive wrong answer choice. I know it's going to grab a lot of people.
Yeah, September and November of last year being classic examples of us both doing that.
Full of it. Every other question I went through, I was like, oh boy, this is just, that would cause destruction. And so we don't know that for sure, but on a broad scale, and including a number of test takers who I know score extremely well and who I have confidence in, the feedback felt really reasonable to me. This was not the problem on this test.
Yeah.
And that's 50% of the exam right there.
Yeah, which again, all of this is going to factor into our scale discussion here very shortly. Do you think, Dave, that in part maybe people gave LR a break, as it were, let LR off the hook in terms of difficulty just because the games were such a standout moment?
It can happen. I think we can see that, and this is going to bleed right into our scale discussion. Yeah. So we might as well just let it.
Setting up a segue.
Yeah, let's take that segue. The way it works, at least for a lot of test takers, is that logic games is the bellwether section. Do well on games, and all of a sudden the entire test becomes rose-tinted, and, the trumpets play and the heavens open. That moment's like, I did well on games. It infuses the rest of the test with a degree of optimism that is sometimes unwarranted. On the flip side, when you have a challenging section or somebody struggles in logic games, it often infuses the rest of the test with this very dark, gloomy feeling.
Or it sets up a dichotomy, a juxtaposition between sections where they're like, God, games were so bad. I mean, at least logical reasoning felt better than games.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that logical reasoning was easier than past logical reasonings. It's just you had this catastrophe by which all else gets measured.
It felt relatively easier is the argument that you're making.
Relative being the operative word.
Even though it might by itself be hard.
Right.
Again, the relativity flaw. So as we look at that, though, that bellwether aspect, this informed how we made scale predictions yesterday. And this was something that Jon and I talked about before we actually released it. And it's a challenge. I mean, to be honest, predicting scales, it's really tough to get a sense. Like if I were to take a test, I can get a much different feel for what the scale is actually going to be. But in this instance, where we're really dealing with feedback and experience, and we knew this test had been administered before, I can go back and kind of like sift through a lot of information. The game section, though, has a compounding effect on how people perform. And when you have that kind of trouble in logic games, it usually affects people elsewhere. And so as we looked at scales over the last couple of years and we considered this particular test, the number that we arrived at was that you could miss 12 questions to get a 170.
Yeah.
Which in the historical pantheon of scales is not among the easiest or loosest of scales.
It's normal.
We've got 13 and
normal.
14.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got 13 and 14 scales out there. And so in the overall pantheon, that is not approaching that. However, in the last 5 years, the loosest scale that you've seen is 12. And so my feeling is that the logic games on this were enough to move it towards that harder side. Now, this is where it gets tough. And we talked about, how the logic games affects people and whether or not LR was easy or not. If I were forced to move off that minus 12 number, interestingly enough, I'd go to minus 11.
What were you immediately yesterday? Can I call you out on this a little bit?
Well, I was thinking, I'm like, man, these games were so tough that I probably would have said, like, right off the hip, yeah, it could be 13.
Right.
And then you sit down, and this is why, we do it really fast. We're able to predict it usually within about an hour. And to be honest, we probably should take more time. Because
I think we made the prediction yesterday while people on the West Coast were still sitting there taking the test.
That's the way to do it, man. Well, the thing is I start getting inundated with requests for what do you think? And I'm like, sometimes, one time recently, somebody messaged me 20 minutes after the first people on the East Coast had gotten out and said, what's the scale? And I'm like, whoa. 20 minutes? You got to give me more time.
Come on,
man. I'm not a computer.
Yeah.
So, that kind of like difficulty. But as the day went on, the one thing I said yesterday was that the minus 12 was a preliminary prediction. And if I were forced to redo it, I might say minus 11. And by tomorrow, maybe I will actually say minus 11. I might come out and say, all right, the final official is. And the reason for that is the reading comp and the two logical reasoning sections, which comprise really over 75% of the test.
The vast majority.
The vast majority of this, they do not appear to be overly difficult. And so that makes me concerned that the games didn't drive this into the minus 12 area, and instead it might be minus 11.
Yeah, somebody who says to me, like, I missed at least 3 more questions in games than I usually miss. I turn around and I'm like, were the other 3 sections easy enough that you would have gotten 1 more right than normal in each?
Yeah.
Because now you're back to even.
Yeah, in a sense, having this conversation live, it makes me feel like there's a.
No, you're actually. I can feel your brain
11.
shifting now as we talk about.
This is where this is tough, And sometimes people are like, "Oh, just pick a number." I'm like, I don't just pick a number. You have to make an assessment. Is there a degree of guesstimation in this? Of course.
Of course there is.
There's only a select number of people that know the actual scale of this test right now, and they are all in Newtown, Pennsylvania. I am not in Newtown, Pennsylvania, so you can draw the logical conclusion from that. And I don't want to be in Newtown, by the way.
I don't think they want to be in Newtown.
I can't speak to that. I like where I'm at. But the bottom line is that it really depends on how hard the logic games were as to whether or not this is a minus 12 curve. I could see it being 11, and if somebody came out and said, yeah, it's 11, I wouldn't be surprised right now.
I wouldn't either.
I
hope it's 12. I hope it's 14. What I've said to you, and I said to a couple of people earlier yesterday, I said this to you earlier today, is look, if they administer this test in 2011, 2012, it probably is a minus 13. It might be a minus 14. There were some minus 14s back there. December 2011 was minus 14. December 2013 was minus 14. Those tests exist, but they haven't existed in a long time. The last time we saw even a minus 13 was June 2014, over 5 years ago. So I think, again, if we're looking at this test through a long historical lens, sure, it's easy to talk about 13s, 14s. If we're looking at this test on a more, I would think, topical now kind of lens, we're talking 11 or 12.
Agreed.
Yeah. The last, 4 tests have been 10, 10, 11, 10.
That's actually my biggest fear here. And it's probably, we'll see what I do on Twitter tomorrow if I'm like, all right, I got to wake up. I'm going to go back through a few other things that I haven't had a chance to really look at closely. But the most recent scales and the tightness and knowing some of the difficulty levels there, that's what really gives me the concern that you could have a tighter scale. It's just, This is the fact of life at this point.
Yeah.
The level of preparation that people go through in terms of studying is greater today than it ever has been.
Sure.
And they have to control that to keep that normalized scale distribution. And so one of the ways they do that is they use various difficulty points within the test, as we talked about earlier, but they also use the scale.
Yeah.
And that's what makes our job, I think, in times like this, the most challenging, because they have their own agenda. Sometimes we know it, sometimes we don't. And Consequently, you sometimes are really on the edge of a knife in terms of trying to figure out exactly which way to go.
Yeah, here's something I'm going to say for the first time. I haven't said it to you. I haven't made it public. I haven't even said this to any students yet. To me, the closest analog to this test in terms of construction is September 2016. Had a really hard set of games. Had that computer virus game, and game 4 in that test was not a piece of cake either. And the scale on that for 101 questions was minus 12. Since September 2016, scales have tightened. That's just a truth.
Yeah, you got a -9 out there from like, what was it, June 2017?
June 2017. And then June 2018 was minus 10, but it was 100 questions there. June 2019 was minus 10 with 102 questions. You had to get 92 right. That's the most recent release test. Scales have tightened since September 2016, which to me is... And I'm not saying the game types were the same. If you're like, ooh, I'm going to prepare for this by going to study that, that's not what I mean.
We're talking about overall difficulty.
Talking about just spread of difficulty, distribution of difficulty.
Composition.
That's right. That to me is the closest analog to this. And you got only a minus 12 3 years ago. Scales have tightened since then. And I want to say, I think the reading comp on this one was probably a little easier. If this goes minus 11, man, I'm not going to be the least bit surprised.
We may go minus 11.
I'm staying at minus 12.
It's such a difficult
I think
thing.
it's minus 12, but minus 11 wouldn't in the least bit wake me up. Now, if this goes minus 9 or 10, then I'd be like, what?
Yeah, and this is the risk. You know, we put ourselves out there by doing this.
We really do.
And I'm okay with it because it's like, where did I read this once? Like, all predictions wrong or your money back. Like, the podcast didn't cost you anything. We're sorry.
Yeah.
We want to be right, but
we're trying.
It can be really difficult, and you notice that not a lot of people try to do it. In fact, no one else tries to do it.
Just about it. But we also have a really good track record of this. So, I feel like even at our worst, we're really good.
As I always say, we're either most typically on it or off by 1.
Yeah. I think if we're off by 1 at 12, yeah, we're off by 1 on the bad side of it.
That's exactly right. I've been off by 2 a single time, and it was so irritating. I was so mad at myself afterwards. But part of it was because I'd listened to some input that was very prejudicial to me from who it was coming from, and it turned out...
Sorry about that, by the way. It's my bad.
It wasn't you.
I know.
But yeah, they'd had some problems that really weren't universal. And so, but that's not what I'm seeing here. This feels very universal with the logic game. So minus 11, minus 12, I wouldn't be at all surprised. And that's definitely what our expectation is right now.
All right, I'll tell you what, if you're going to go to minus 11, I haven't
done it yet.
I know, but I can feel the angle.
Feel it?
Yeah. You're leaning like a Samsung tablet. I can feel you. If you're going to go to minus 11, let's put a friendly gentleman's wager on this. With high stakes.
These things haven't even been done, and you already want to bet on it.
I can feel you leaning. Yeah.
I may just stick at 12 just to spite you.
Just to avoid it.
Yeah. What is the bet, though?
1 night with your wife. She's like, what did I do to lose a bet?
You know, the funniest thing is I know exactly how she'd respond. Absolutely not. Go away.
Yeah. Well, what would she say to me?
That's a great comeback. She'd say the same thing to you. Oh God, she's got the highest level of integrity of anybody I've ever met.
Does.
So
yeah,
there's no there's nothing that would go there.
She's the best.
I have zero concerns about her, which is a glorious thing.
She is the best. Better Nizer, actually, even winning a bet. Better Nizer.
Yeah, she met one of my longest standing students, a guy that you know, Dave, from down in Los Angeles. She met him for the first time yesterday, and they hit it off, which was really cool.
He's a pretty affable dude too, but
he's great.
I've never seen her not get along with people.
That's true,
or at least fake it well.
Well, that also. All right, so let's get to the last question, really, and that is, if you're sitting here and you're trying to think about whether you keep your score or you cancel it, what's the motivations there?
Yeah, what do you do in this 6-day window that comes next? This is a little tricky because this is the first time in a while we've had to talk about this in terms of you've used one of your repeats, frankly, or your retakes. Now you're down to 2 more before next June if you've just taken September. And that's true whether you keep or cancel. So you've burned one if you're sitting for this thing today, yesterday, this week. Generally, my advice is unless you know your score has either gone down from a past attempt or is going to be so low that it's just not going to be of any potential use to you, you should keep it.
Agreed.
Objections to that?
No, in fact, I will second that. And the truth of this decision is it's never easy, but there's some interesting factors. And to summarize what you said, if you feel like you've had a disastrously bad performance or you have for sure underperformed either your practice test range or a score that you have on record, I'm all about canceling. Why keep it?
Agreed.
Because it's just not good enough for you.
Yeah.
And so let it go. If you think that you have scored reasonably or you possibly have even improved on a score that you already have by even a point, keep it.
Yeah, let it ride.
Which means for most people, the choice is to keep. Now, in a test like this where logic games cause a lot of problems, I think we'll probably see a few more cancellations than expected.
Yeah. As a callback, though, never cancel at the test center and certainly don't walk out during. I know we've said that before. I just can't reiterate it strongly enough. If you're going to cancel, you got 6 days. Take your time. Finish the tests. Do your best. See what happens. Get this kind of input after the fact because we tend to provide it.
Yeah. Now, one of the big questions that I get a lot afterwards is somebody who says, all right, for example, I have a 162 on record already. Mm-hmm. And what should I do here? I'm not sure what happened. I think I might have done worse, but I might have done better. That to me is still a keep situation. And that is because law schools still only care about the high score. So if you go 162 and then you go 160, law schools look at that and they're like, you're still a 162 to me.
Yeah.
You know, you are your high point, as they say.
Yeah, the cancel's like a 162, 148, or a 153, or something where you're like, I know I screwed that up.
Yeah, why? Then at that point, there's no value in even having it there.
Yeah.
It's just not going to do anything for you. If you're like, I for sure messed this up and it's not even close, I know myself well enough to know that it was just a disaster, then you cancel.
Sure.
But don't be worried about, I might have scored a few points lower. It's worth the risk of maybe you got a little bit better. And sometimes people don't have a really good sense of where they're scoring. This is why we talk about every time you take a practice test, you should estimate what you scored so you can start developing some radar for that. There's a whole blog post that we have.
Such a good point, yeah.
It really is. And it's something I always tell people to do, and then they never do it. And then afterwards, I'm like, so what do you think? Oh, I don't know. I'm like, come on.
You can calibrate your self-assessment ahead of time, basically.
Yeah, you can become better at knowing what your opinions are about tests like this because it's all standard. So just keep those things in mind. Don't worry about it if you're a few points lower than a score on record. And if you're like, well, I'm going to keep my score and then I'm hoping I can do better next time, that's fine too. If you go 156 and then next time you get a 160, you're the 160.
Yeah.
You are your high score, and that is the bottom line for every single law school out there.
Yeah. Regardless, keep or cancel, if you do find yourself in a position where you need to retake it, then November is your next available opportunity unless you're already signed up for October. We talked about this deadline stuff before. You need to sign up for November before the 10th of October. But the sooner you can do that, the better. And if you know you're going to cancel this test, pull the trigger. Cancel it, sign up for November. Centers are filling up. Even if it means you get on a wait list, do it as soon as possible. They keep track of wait list position. Yeah.
And the other thing is this, is if you're thinking, well, I can't do November, but I'm doing January, sign up for that as soon as possible too, because those test centers are closed up in some places already.
That's right.
So it's astonishing.
I'd like to think this goes without saying, but I guess if I'm going to say it, it doesn't. If you are going to have to retake this test, whether on the heels of a cancel or a kept score that's not good enough, you need to also be thinking very strongly about what it is that you're going to do for yourself to make sure that your next attempt is either your final attempt or at least an improvement. This is the time to buckle down, to redouble your efforts. If you read a book but needed a course, if you did a course but need tutoring, this is the time to invest in that greater degree of opportunity to improve. You have to do that now.
And an invest is the right word there too.
I know what I
We don't often talk about this because we focus more on actual like LSAT content. But the thing that I often hear is like, well, it's expensive. It's $500 or it's $1,000. We know that. But keep this in mind. Your LSAT score is going to have a tremendous impact on your admission chances and also on the financial packages you are offered. So maybe a course is the best way for you to prepare. You've been reading books, but you're like, I don't want to pull the trigger on that. Think about it this way. All right, maybe if I invest $1,300 here, I'm going to get an extra $30,000 in financial aid because I've improved my score. And all of a sudden, instead of it being a foolish or a waste of money, a foolish decision or a waste of money, right, it's turned into something that has repaid itself over and over and over again.
Exponentially. Yeah, by factors of 10, factors of 20. I've taught classes with, at the end of it, like $1 million+ in financial aid just based on score improvement. I'm sure you have too.
It's an incredible kind of like relationship between as your LSAT score goes up and your GPA as well, that you begin to see more and more money. It is just a very black and white system out there. And I wish I could say, well, you wrote the best personal statement and so they decided to give you an extra 40 grand. Amazingly enough, that rarely seems to happen.
Yeah, not so amazingly enough. That never really happens. And your GPA is largely fixed if you're listening to this. Even if you're a junior, you're probably through the majority of what your GPA is going to do fluctuation-wise.
Yeah.
The LSAT's the one big malleable factor. And man, does it count. So, again, this is not self-serving. This is purely, I think, us just being real with people listening to this. You have to do everything you can to squeeze every point out of your potential.
Well, we'd love for you to take one of our courses, but if you don't, we still think taking a course is a good idea.
Sure. Well,
there are two places that I say don't skimp. When it comes to preparing for the LSAT, and of course I could make this about something else too, but I'm going to keep it to the LSAT and law school, and the other is with your law school applications. Those are the two areas where you can get the most return for any time and money invested. So that's where you should be focused.
Yeah, the bang for your buck, as it were.
Yes, indeed. Now, one last point is if you do keep your score from this past September test, don't forget that at some point, if you don't have a writing sample on record, you will need to take it separately. And that's important because they'll give you your score, but they won't release it to law schools until they have a writing sample on record. So, and there's been some issues with taking the writing sample because you take it at home, which is cool, but there's been problems. So you want to make sure that if this is something where you're trying to get your applications in as early as possible, you get on top of the writing sample immediately.
Yeah, you've got a year to do it, but if you're trying to apply this fall, just get it done. You're still in LSAT mode. Get this all behind you. And if you want to hear more about the writing sample, not only how it works, but just general guidelines and guidance on how to craft the best possible one, go listen to podcast episode 15 that Dave and I did. It'll walk you through everything you need to know, quite literally everything you need to know about the writing sample. Or the LSAT writing, as it's now called.
The LSAT writing. It'll always be the writing sample to me.
Me too, buddy.
I think that about wraps it up. Any final point?
No, except for the general well wishes for anyone who took it, either yesterday or perhaps even after listening to this weekend. Guys, we're thinking about you. You're in our thoughts. We're wishing you well. If this didn't go as well as you'd hoped, like we just said, buckle down, redouble your efforts, do better next time. The good news is you've got further opportunities to take this test and continue to improve. Let this be a learning experience. Don't let it beat you up. You are not defined by this number. It's a data point, and it tells you a lot about what you need to do next and how you need to grow beyond it. That's all.
I second that. And if you kept your score, you've now got the long wait until Monday, October 14th, when scores will come around about 9 a.m. Eastern time. Right. So set your clock because that's when we'll see the results of this one.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Everybody, thanks so much for listening. We've enjoyed it. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube, or anywhere else you find it. Give us a rating, and if you have any questions, we're going to do a mailbag pretty soon, so you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com or even lsat@powerscore.com if you don't want to type out all the letters. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.